Welcome everybody to Believers and Nonbelievers in Discussion. This is episode number 5, and today we are on the topic of micro versus macro evolution. We have a very good panel today. I've got Paul Geem from scientifictheology.com, Kelly Clemenson from Areopagus Project. We're kind of one person short, so I'm going to be sort of doing dual duty as a panelist and not so much a moderator, but maybe a host. Troy Britton is from the website, the blog site, pigeonchest.com, and he was a volunteer in putting together the talkorigins.org site quite a few years ago, a number of years ago.
Well, involved in the answering feedback questions page.
Okay. So he's got pretty extensive knowledge. We're going to start with our usual a few minutes of introduction from each person, and then go into some back and forth and really start to try to flesh out this idea. So let's see, Kelly, do you want to start this time just to mix it up?
Sure. I think most of you have been here before, but if you're not, my name is Kelly Clemenson. I do a ministry on Thursday nights called the Areopagus Project. Discussion about topics, this and that, mainly to do whether God exists or not. I've got a verse that I'd like to read, and I'd like to try to help understand what we're going to talk about today. But the one I wanted to read was Psalm 139, starting verse 13. It says, "For you formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." We're going to get into some technical stuff today, and I hope that doesn't get lost on the fact, and I'm hoping that it doesn't. To me, this isn't really a debate about the technicalities of it all. To me, it's a debate on whether or not you were made for a purpose and a meaning, or whether it was just all accidental. One thing led to another, and presto changeo, you're here. No necessarily direction, no necessarily intent on you being here. I hope that sticks through the conversation, because it can get kind of technical. Maybe some of that gets lost and start to drowse off. But that's, at least I think maybe Paul might agree with me that we're aiming at that. You can certainly get technical. I mean, Paul's very knowledgeable in it. I know a little bit, but that's what I was hoping that would stick throughout the conversation, is that's what we're trying to aim at. Thanks.
We'll see where it goes.
Yeah.
Because I do want to try to keep you on the topic, but obviously that's an element. So
certainly happy to do that.
Yeah. So we'll see how it goes, but full reign as to start, and then we'll see where it goes. Okay. Paul.
Well, I suppose that we can start at the beginning, or at least as close to the beginning of this subject as we can, and that is Carolus Linnaeus, Carl von Linné, who started classifying various plants and animals, and came up with the Systema Naturae. And the original intent was to find the created kinds, and he started out thinking that was probably on the species level. With time, he came to conclude that was probably closer to the genus, or maybe even the family level. And that is, I think, the consensus of the people that I have talked to, and certainly makes the most sense to me, that it depends on how you define macroevolution. If you define it as simply speciation, then I think that it is arguable that they may be the same process. When you get to what George Gaylord Simpson called mega-evolution, which is families and above, you're in a different world, and it's probably a different process as to how things got there. To put that in a little bit of perspective, all the dogs are pretty much obviously related to each other in some way.
Put the mic a little closer there. So
All the dogs are probably related to each other in some way. As a matter of fact, the wolves and coyotes are related to each other, as we see from the crosses that have now been determined to be the red wolf and the eastern wolf. Horses, donkeys, and zebras are probably all the same. They can still cross, and I have some photos of animals that are part zebra and part horse, or part zebra and part donkey. And of course, it's been known for some time that donkeys and horses can cross and form mules, although, except in rare instances, they are sterile. But once you get beyond the family, it becomes a little more difficult. We haven't, at least to my knowledge, seen for example, a cat-dog hybrid or a dog-bear hybrid. And that's on the level where not only the later Linnaeus in his 12th edition draws the line, but also as people as disparate as Michael Behe and most what I'll call short-age creationists, those who believe that life has been on this earth for only a few thousand years. And so that seems a more, if I can put it this way, natural way to draw the line. And so I don't see the question so much as being a differentiation between macroevolution and microevolution as between the levels below and megaevolution.
define mega evolution for us.
On the family level or above. That's where Simpson defined it, and that's where the other people I mentioned defined it as well.
Okay. I'm sorry, Scott, if you could pull the volume down on him just a little bit. It's easier for me to boost in post than it is to pull out feedback, so. Okay, sorry about that. What year was Linnaeus? I can't remember.
Well, the first
Generation.
edition was, I think, 1735 or so.
Okay.
Of interest in this regard is that the origin of species is entitled that way because Darwin felt at the time that if you could explain species, then the rest of it would come. And if the distinction is really between megaevolution and other changes in life forms, then that isn't necessarily so.
The rest of what would come?
Genus, families, classes, orders, phyla, and so forth.
Okay, the whole phylogeny
Yeah.
arrangement.
Start from one or a few small forms of life and get to the forms that we have now.
Okay. And Troy, you want to give us your initial
I think the first thing that's important to do is distinguish when scientists are talking about macroevolution, there's two different ways they usually are talking about it. In evolution, you have the process of evolution, and you have the pattern of evolution. And often paleontologists will use macroevolution in reference to pattern. And so they're looking at what the pattern of the fossil record shows, extinctions, diversification events, things like that. When neontologists, biologists, usually talking about macroevolution, usually referring to speciation. Now, I think it's a vocal minority of biologists and some paleontologists that also talk about macroevolutionary processes. I'm not sure if Simpson may have been talking about that or whether he was referring to patterns with megaevolution. The primary mechanism, macroevolutionary mechanism that gets bannered about is species selection. And I'm not really clear on how that works separate from microevolutionary processes, which would be mutation and natural selection, what goes on, at a population level. Difficulty often comes when people don't understand the distinctions between the patterning process and start asking for evidence about macroevolution, like as if cats are going to give birth to dogs, that kind of a thing, which makes no sense biologically. So that's probably the primary thing, is understanding the distinction between process and pattern, and what's being talked about when you're talking about macroevolution with those regards. I guess that's it, Brent.
Okay.
To start.
I'm going to lay down one foundation, and then I have a question for you, Paul.
Sure.
I want to make sure we're all on the same page for what a species is. So let's start there. So how do you define a species?
Well, in general, I generally take species as what the biologists say they are. And of course, that's a horribly utilitarian way of doing it. Canis familiaris is the common dog. Wild Canis familiaris are still Canis familiaris. What happens if one of those things happens to mate with a wolf? What do you call that thing? Well, it used to be we'd call it a husky. Nowadays we call it a red wolf or an eastern wolf. I guess because those are really coyote versus wolf rather than dog. And the truth of the matter is that the definition of species, if I understand the literature correctly, is pretty slippery. The Linnaean species was a group that kind of more or less stayed with its own group. But then what do you do with the Darwin's finches that will interbreed with each other if put in close enough proximity? And then what do you call the hybrids? So it becomes a very sticky situation in terms of what you call a species. And so, I mean, I'm just trying to be honest. I can't figure out how you can make a nice, unequivocal definition that everybody will agree with.
Well, I would think that it is sort of, there's a gradual process in terms of or gradations between what's a species and what's not. I mean, the finches is a good example. You take one finch that has a longer beak than the other, right?
Yeah.
The adaptation that Kelly has referred to, I think, before. The definition that I have heard, this is sort of broad, so is two that cannot mate, basically. So but then you're right, kind of like the wolf and the dog coming to a red wolf, it gets a little fuzzy. So how do you hear it most commonly defined?
What you're talking about is the biological, I guess Meyer that came up with it, or coined it, the biological species concept. And that's basically where you have, organisms that can interbreed. I have to be careful. You can have organisms that biologically are able to reproduce, but would not normally in the wild ever do so for various reasons. Some of them behaviorally, it could be that the male and the female, put them in the same area and they don't like each other because of the coloration, or one doesn't do the right dance, or whatever it might be. But if you were to take the sperm and egg and mix them in a petri dish, you could produce a viable embryo, or if you force mated them in some way. But yeah, biological species common. Just exactly what you're going to expect under evolution is that you're going to have a gradation from strictly separate species, cannot interbreed at all no matter what, to ones that can produce an offspring like horse and donkey, but it's not viable. to ones that are close enough together that they still can produce a viable offspring.
Is that considered an intermediate, basically on its way to separation? If more changes would happen?
Basically, you're looking, I mean, say with wolves and coyotes could interbreed viably. Donkeys and horses can interbreed, but not viably. And then you get other organisms that are more distantly related, like horses and rhinoceroses cannot interbreed.
Okay.
Although they're both within the perissodactyls, odd-toed ungulates.
What is that? I don't know that.
Tapirs, horses, rhinoceroses, and some extinct types are all grouped in the Perissodactyla is the odd-toed ungulates. So they've got, horses have one toe, rhinos three, as opposed to even-toed ungulates like cows and camels and pigs.
Okay. So Kelly, how do you define species, the way you use it?
Well, as far as the species go, I'm in the family along with Paul. It appears to me that you have families of creatures, whether it be horses, cats, and those are what we consider to be family. And I'm assuming that the conversation is as far as how those cross over from what I assume we're talking about right now is micro.
Well, before
changes,
we get to the how, I'm trying to get the sort of set this. Like, for example, can let's say a cat ancestor, a cat kind from whenever, years ago, just say that.
Okay.
When you have a small beast about this size that will then adapt into bigger and smaller, everything from a lion to a house cat.
Those are species to me.
You consider those. You consider that the same species.
For the most part, they have the same number of chromosomes. There's a few large cats that don't, but most of them do.
Okay.
Most have the same chromosome number.
So then you differ in terms of from what is standard scientific phylogeny setup. It sounds like you're defining kinds, which is like families.
They talk about species like a leopard different from a lion, and there is some differences. Obviously, they're larger, different colors, this and that. But it seems to me that it's the same type of creature.
Well, I'm trying to go to more extreme examples just to make the point.
Well, like ocelots and some of the ones like that, they have a different chromosome number. They have 18 instead of 19. So to me, that would be a different species.
And I'm sorry, what's an ocelot?
It's a smaller cat. It looks an awful lot like a leopard, but they have a different number of chromosomes. They only have 18, where the leopard has 19.
Yeah, so ocelots are Central and South America, whereas leopards are in Africa.
Okay.
So that would be a different number of chromosomes. To me, that would be a different species.
Okay. So just by definition, then you guys are working with a little bit of a different definition, because a house cat can't breed with a lion, just to take two within the same family. So your definition of species is really kind.
Well, yeah. Here's the thing. I'm willing, because otherwise we're going to use the term species and everybody is going to have their own idea. And
that's why I'm trying to lock it down. That's why I'm trying to lock it down.
And that's why I'm saying, I will take whatever the standard definition of the scientific community is, which is a little fuzzy.
Granted.
And, if they call them species, I'm not going to use that. And that's why if I'm going to talk about biblical kinds, I'll say a different word. Or I might qualify it as maybe biblical species if you wanted to put it that way. But I don't like to get into arguments over definitions in general. I generally speaking take the other guy's definition and then just accept it.
Okay.
But to go on to say that some of those properties may not go together, and so the definition is a little fuzzy, and I'll just say so up front.
And we're also being a little animal-centric here. You start talking about plants and even more particular microorganisms. What we think about as species for like vertebrates doesn't apply at all, because like microorganisms, you're talking about largely asexually reproducing organisms that.
And it's worse than that, because when they do have a genome exchange, which they rarely but sometimes do, they'll cross species lines without any problem whatsoever.
Yeah, they'll pick up bits of genetic material from the
And-
environment and
and
incorporate them in. And
Just to give an example, Staphylococcus aureus will be happy to take the methicillin resistance genes that happen to be in a E. coli or something, and take them right across and become methicillin resistant Staph aureus. So, from medicine point of view, it's an important distinction there. I'm not aware of too many, elephants trading genomes with bats, for example.
Okay.
you have bits of virus that get incorporated sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, not metazoan to metazoan.
In fact, viruses have been known to transfer some of these bits of genetic information from bacteria to bacteria. And it's not just direct contact, it can be through viroids that
Okay.
produce it. There is one thing that we probably should say about this, and that is you gave the example of a house cat not mating with a lion.
That's what I wanted to ask that.
And I'd be careful about using that too strongly, and the reason why is because there aren't too many Great Danes that mate with Chihuahuas either.
Yeah.
So the size differential can matter even Great Danes can mate with German Shepherds, who can mate with, and go down the line, and eventually you get to Chihuahuas as well.
Yeah.
And so even though at the extremes they're kind of separate from each other.
Well, I mean, then pick another example, like two.
Tigers and lions are kind of like donkeys and horses. They'll produce a sterile hybrid. They're roughly the same size animals.
But my question would be, in the petri dish, can a house cat's egg be crossed with a tiger's sperm?
I don't know.
And still
Not
produce it?
I don't know if that's ever been attempted.
I don't know that that's been done, and I don't know that anybody's attempted to do anything with the result.
All right. That's one of those things that we can only go so far in a panel like this
'cause they
unless
have
we
the same
don't
number
have
of
the
chromosomes,
information.
So you
yeah.
would think they would be able to, but maybe the experiment hasn't been tested yet.
And I would think that the issue would be broader, more than just the number of chromosomes. But I
Well,
don't
there's
know enough
information
about
involved
it.
in
So.
it. There's lots of stuff, but that's one of the defining factors.
Well, there's a problem even with that, and that is that there are some deer in Southeast Asia that apparently look identical to each other, except that one has 7 chromosomes and the other one has 42 or something like that. So whatever is happening there, whether it's splitting or lumping or we are seeing mechanisms that we only dimly appreciate.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we're going to find out a lot more about this. As a matter of fact, I just saw something this week about a proposal to do DNA mapping on every species. I mean, literally a long-term study, and they're going to start on the first 1.5 million at the microbiological level and move from there. And ultimately, a couple generations from now, we're going to have that information.
And
That'll
even
be
with that
interesting.
attempt, you're going to have problems. And this is exemplified by human DNA.
Yes.
What we have mostly is Venter's DNA.
What DNA?
Venter, Craig Venter, I believe it is.
Oh, you mean his personal DNA?
His personal
as
DNA
the type specimen.
is the type specimen.
Yeah.
And what we're finding out is that there is not a great deal, but there is significant difference between the DNA of various people, which, if you think about it, is not terribly surprising given the hair color variations, the nose variations, the the tendency to get fat variations. I deal with that all the time in my profession, where you can't assume that the person who comes in has human DNA. They have type-specific human DNA, and you better pay attention to what that type is.
So, I mean, that's an odd way to phrase it, because I mean, obviously there are differences in between individuals in any species.
Yeah, and some of them are cultural and all that, how long we cut our hair and stuff like that. But some of them
Well, no,
are
not
actually,
culture. I mean, just genetic.
some of them are genetic. They are.
Yeah.
And,
There's
most of us up here would be in considerable danger if we had to spend our lives outside in the tropics from skin trouble. And that's an advantage up north where you need lots of vitamin D. It's a disadvantage if you know.
That's individual variation.
Yeah.
That's not to say that we can't tell a human from a Neanderthal.
That is true.
For example. So there's at some point.
You say a lot of variation. It's relative to other things. You always have to bear that in mind. There might be a fair amount of variation within humans, but compared to other organisms, we're not that varied. I mean, us compared to chimps, there's a lot more difference between us and chimps and amongst humans.
Okay. So, go ahead. Let's see what you've got.
Okay. Do you have questions that you want to go up, Paul? I've got one.
Go for it.
So the topic we have today is macro and microevolution. Does that, in either of your minds, and I'm asking each of you individually, does that necessarily disprove the idea of a supreme being? Is that the subject matter today? Because that's the subject matter in a lot of talks about micro and macroevolution, whether that process has replaced the idea of a designer, supreme being designer, however you want to define that.
Do you want to go for that?
Yeah, on that specific, no, does not. Clearly, you have plenty of biologists like Ken Miller, who's a devout Catholic, who would have no problem with standard ideas about macroevolution. And it goes on all the way back to Darwin's time. Biologists and paleontologists then who were Christians who had no problem accepting evolution. So, no, it's a separate question.
Well, the micro and the macro is what I'm talking about. The micro, I think everybody agrees with that. Anybody that's
I don't know if the
Stay talk
distinction would have been made as clearly back then as it is now. Was it the Russian guy in the teens or something like that coined the term macroevolution? It's a separate question. Accepting evolution, accepting macroevolution. It's only if you have a particular theology or maybe family of theology where it becomes an issue. So beyond that, no.
So this isn't, you're not considering this to be soup to humans type discussion?
Okay, so
No.
Soup meaning the primordial soup.
If you want to take it that far as being the pattern of evolution, then no, we're talking the origin of life to the current biodiversity.
Are you talking more about once the first cell gets here, then we have
however
discussion
life
after
originated, again, there'd be plenty of people with theological beliefs that could accept that and do. It's only, as far as my experience is, that certain people have a particular theology that they have a problem with that being the case. So to me, it's not accept this or that unless you have that particular theology.
Well, if I may object to that characterization slightly.
Go for it.
Michael Behe has, as far as I know, the exact same theological background as Kenneth Miller. Kenneth Miller accepts all the way from the first life, and maybe even then. He does not want to, if I read him correctly, he does not want to take a stand on that. Being completely where if there is divine influence, it cannot be detected. Michael Behe, as I mentioned before, actually says that above the family level, you're not going to get a naturalistic evolution. Now, his solution is to have one that has some assistance. But he bases that not on his theology, because his theology is exactly the same as that of Kenneth Miller. He bases that on the observation that it is beastly hard to try to account for it on the basis of current evolutionary theory. And I think that that's an important point. This is not just the scientists who can all kind of agree versus the theological people who really don't, they can get up to a certain point and then their theology stops them. In the case of Michael Behe in particular, his theology clearly did not stop him, and did not cause him to draw the lines he does. He draws them because of where the math looks like it's going.
Well, that's what he says.
You're going to call him a liar?
Not necessarily a liar, no. But I would question whether his objections ultimately truly are due to, what the science is. And it's kind of tough with him. I mean, I see him all the time argued that he accepts, he's sort of like an old earth evolutionist of some sort, where he accepts common descent. But then I see him do things where he actually challenges things that there's no reason to challenge. Like he was one of the first people that started talking about comparative embryology and bringing up Ernst Haeckel in his embryo drawings before Jonathan Wells did. And why would you bring up an objection to that? Because that's a common descent evidence, comparative embryology, if you don't object to common descent. But here he is bringing that up, which to me strongly implies he does object to common descent, not just naturalistic evolution.
Yeah, but there's a problem with that, and that is that Stephen Jay Gould objected to the way evolution is presented in the textbooks, and in fact wrote a famous article which he entitled in German, and then put the English translation because he knew that most of his audience was English, and the translation is atrocious, and I think it's absurdlich or something like that.
That was
pardon my German.
His view in response, particularly to what the ideas that Haeckel had supposedly fudged his drawings.
Yes,
not
of course.
To the evidence from comparative embryology.
Wasn't Gould?
But the whole point of that was that Hegel fudged comparative embryology.
Well, he fudged his drawings.
He fudged his drawings in order to show that comparative embryology made his point. He, shall we say, gilded the image a little.
Right.
Except that if you actually look at the embryos, the evidence is still there regardless of Haeckel's drawings.
Yeah, I mean,
well, some of it is.
Yeah.
Depends on how you draw the lines there.
I'd have to ask what specifically he created out of nothing.
Well, I mean, no doubt that Hegel's drawings were not appropriate at the time, but that particular issue, and I don't want to get off on a tangent.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is that comparative embryology,
that particular issue has been researched independently beyond those
comparative
years.
Embryology is a place where I think that if I were of any stripe, some kind of creationist or intelligent design, or as Stephen Jay Gould was simply an honest evolutionist, would say, you know what, this was done badly. There may be some points in there, but the fact that it's been done badly means that you better be really careful about how you use those points.
But Hegel aside, because he was caught in doing what he did. He did his own drawings or whatever it was. Use the information that we have now. How does it look now with current research? I mean, this has obviously been investigated, and people have opinions on it in state-of-the-art current science.
Like frequently, you get the idea from reading creationist literature on the subject that Haeckel somehow invented the idea that vertebrate embryos have gills, quote unquote, gill slits, pharyngeal clefts as embryos. Haeckel did not invent that idea. Those were described by a guy named Rathke before Haeckel was even born.
Well, again, Troy, I want to get it away from Hegel because that's what,
Yeah.
150, 200 years
Right.
ago or something.
Well, the reason
question is
that I
what's-
bring it up is simply because the accusation that Behe is being biased somehow by his theology against
Yeah.
this kind of thing. That's just nuts if you look at what the Pope has said. You know,
The Pope
and the
is-
Pope defines Catholicism, if I understand it correctly, or comes as close as anybody. And he's accepted basically everything except at some point the soul came in. And so Behe has absolutely no theological reason to go this way. And this is one of the canards that's used all the time, and I'm objecting to it, that it's simply a matter of, well, you know, we have this theology, and our theology will stop us from going where the evidence really leads.
Yeah. I'm going to differ on that, but leave it for another day. I will say I prefer the Dalai Lama to the Pope because I think there's more science education there, but that's just my offhand knowledge.
He may very well be.
So
There's the same argument that can be made for people that supposedly are just science. This idea of scientism, where it's completely apart from anybody's opinion, you know that isn't true.
Yeah, we're gonna
everybody brings their opinion.
We're going to do scientism
Right.
and get into that in some
Everybody
detail.
brings their opinion to the table, and if they want to go a certain direction and try to prove what their goal is at the end, you can accuse either side of that. And just saying that just because somebody happens to be a Christian, they can't do proper research, that's not true.
Yeah.
I specifically did not say that.
Okay, but you
I
implied
actually
that
said the
because-
opposite, that there are plenty of
You
Christians
implied that
who do
because
accept.
Behe's a
evolution
Christian,
can be
therefore he's going to
science.
come to that conclusion.
Well,
I mean,
he's
it
the one
might
that brought
be.
up Behe.
But it might be, but the same could be said from Dawkins. Can be said. He's got a odd hatred of somebody who doesn't think he exists. And I think once you come to that conclusion in your head, it's very easy to travel down the road of trying to prove it. So my point is either side can go down that road of having what they termed here recently with when my friend Jay was up here, cognitive dissonance. They're not going to look. They're going to go down that road, whether the evidence is supportive from the other side or not.
I'm going to disagree to the extent, without getting too much detail, that there is more at stake on the Christian side.
I don't think so at all.
Well, the eternal life is what you're
and
you know,
the idea that your
what's at
education,
stake for you. So
then the idea that your education that's brought you down an atheistic path is now bankrupt. That you get the same problem.
I
You
think it's
like who's the guy that was the dentist that I can't remember his name now. Mark Easton. He had that same issue. He went through college. He had spent a lot of money on his education, and involved. From a dentist point of view, I'm not sure how much that was involved, but to a certain extent it was. And he said he went out in the backyard, sat on his lounge chair, took out some tapes from A.E. Wilder Smith, took out some cassette tapes from A.E. Wilder Smith, and he sat there and listened to them. And his comment was, A.E. Wilder Smith and some $6 cassette tapes destroyed millions of dollars of my education. And he came away from it with a different opinion. So my point is that idea, traveling down the road for atheism, is the same boat. You could have an invested interest in that point of view, and it's just as hard to change your mind from that invested interest as it would be from what you guys would say creationists like me would have a vested interest in not changing my mind. I don't agree.
I'm just going to
We don't agree on that.
I'm just going to disagree and put a spike
We'll
in
agree
it.
to-
We'll get back
Kind
to
of
it.
far afield from.
Can you go back?
Well,
Can you get back
if I
to
can,
your?
if I
agree.
can say this, as long as we don't, as soon as things start getting difficult, throw out to the other person, well, that's just because you're a Christian or an atheist.
Oh no!
I think
no.
I think we're going to do okay, but my point is that Behe is reacting to some scientific stuff, And I think that if one fails to account for the scientific stuff, then one certainly is not going to bring Behe along. One's not going to bring anybody who looks at things the same way Behe is. And so, I'm asking for us to rather than shoot down Behe as a closet creationist of some kind.
Yeah.
He's definitely not.
Well, I mean, Kelly knows that I do a lot of reading, and I'd read both sides. I mean, when we did Origin, I read
As you find out, there's
Stephen
like
Meyer.
all 20 sides. But
Well, I mean, you can only do so much in life, and so I do consider the arguments, and every time I've done that, I have found significant errors in logic, and we're kind of taking it a topic at a time. So
Yeah.
And we don't have anybody here enough to get into. I don't want to do a panel on Behe specifically. I'm gonna go back to your question.
Okay.
Ask it again so I can get an answer. I was like, I've lost track of it.
Does this debate between the idea of what we're doing today is microevolution, macroevolution, the definition for those, like I said, me and Paul would agree on some of it, and with you and everybody else that has studied it. But my question is, does this process eliminate the need for supreme being, God, whatever version, whatever term you want to use for that, a designer? Does that eliminate? Are you trying to make it? This process would eliminate, and apparently we're just going from
Enough.
first cell to us
Enough
today.
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
When you've got adaptation, and then you can extrapolate it to microevolution, to speciation. There's more detail in there we'll get to, but that is a process from what we know, from everything we've learned from the 1800s to now, can happen without deity intervention. Now, that's not to say that a deity didn't, give a boost and create an enzyme here and there. We have no way of telling that because there's no way to measure that.
It's untestable.
It's untestable. It also doesn't exclude the deism kind of thing where you've got a god, small g, who, not any specific one, right, who created the universe in a way that it could have been, evolution could have been the process to generate, from A to Z. Yeah. So from the process itself, you don't need the deity to do it. I see. So no, but I see it from the other side. I see it from your side, evolution being attacked to shoehorn a deity into the process.
Okay. You have, again, and I think Paul's trying to get at this too. You have to define what we're talking about. We're not talking about whether or not a species can adapt.
Well, we're talking about the difference
talking
between
about that
adaptation and one species changing into
fine,
another.
But you got to understand at least what I'm getting at is the idea that one can become another.
Okay.
Because
Yes.
there's instructions.
Well, I'm answering your question first.
But on this, I just want to make sure that you understand, everybody understands what we're talking about here. We're on the micro level. Whether or not a bear can be whether a panda is the same, I don't know, but whether a bear can be a grizzly bear, a brown bear that lives in California,
Right.
the type that lives at the North Pole, things like that, those came from the same creature, and I think.
Okay. Well, we've all seen the phylogeny.
So there's been some change available.
We've all seen the diagrams of a process from.
Change this. What I'm trying to get at, the change that's built into the bear. We have no argument about that, and we've discussed this several times.
I agree with you.
But
I agree with you. We agree on
But the cross
microevolution.
stuff, okay,
We
that's
agree
where-
on microevolution. We agree
how
on
that works.
We agree on adaptation.
Well,
Because I think the same.
I don't know. Do we? Microevolution would be what you're talking about when you say species adapting. You could call that microevolution. Like
Yeah.
famous example would be the peppered moths in England. Soot built up on the trees from Industrial Revolution. The moths went from being a speckled color to being a black color. That was an adaptation
Sure.
to the local environment.
But the blacks-
Within the species, there's still
But the blacks are.
Beston, Betularia, the peppered moth.
But our point would be the black's already there. If a black moth came along.
Well, there were
with
variants
skies-
in the population that were black, and
Right.
the predominance changed within the population.
Right.
What the information
environment.
that's the instructions,
That's what biologists
Sure.
call microevolution.
and we agree on that. The
But
instructions
if there's
are
a
already there.
speciation event where you have 2 species of moths, that's where macroevolution begins.
I think they're both moths.
Well,
They're always going to be moths because they're always rooted within Lepidoptera, which is the family.
Okay.
well, let's be clear on this though. What we're talking about is not so much whether the predominant moth changes color, or presumably if there was an island, maybe the entire moths changed color because the last light-colored moth got picked off by a bird somewhere. And then from then on, you don't have the light-colored moths because it's too hard to genetically change back. But what we're really saying is that beyond a certain level, can you get everything from one point? And there's a related thing, and that is how much information can be gotten into an animal. And let me just pick an example. Polar bears. Polar bears are white. They can, in fact, cross with Alaskan brown bears, which are interestingly more related to grizzly bears than they are to the brown bear of America. But and you will see, kind of cream-colored bears out of that. But by and large, they mate with their own kind. Be careful of how I say that. Their own subspecies, if you like, or their own species, because I think it by now is generally called by most biologists a separate species, polar bear. But there are 2 things. One of them is that they're not changing into a brand new thing as far as we can tell. They're still bears. They still are related to the bear family. But the other problem is that you're actually looking at a loss of information.
Okay, I need to challenge this. I wasn't going to bring this one up, but since you bring that up, we need to work this one out.
Sure.
Because I see this in creationist literature all the time, that you cannot add information. You were talking about information theory and DNA. You brought up your sign and stuff. It is just patently untrue. You can add information. And the simplest example of that is when you've got a strand of DNA and you have a point mutation, right, which is, for whoever doesn't know, the difference in one nucleotide. There's 3 ways you can do that. You can have a nucleotide that it's an error in creation of a copy of the DNA molecule. You can drop a nucleotide out. You can add one in. Actually, I guess that's just 2, right?
You can add
one in, and move everything down, whatever. So whenever you add one in that wasn't part of the sequence, you've just added information. So,
Or you can have whole duplications of genes.
Yeah, and there's other examples that are more complex. But I mean, just that right there, this whole concept of you cannot add information is false, completely false.
I agree with you 100%.
If you take a sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and number 5 then gets shifted up, and we add a new nucleotide into that 5 space, that's added information.
And
why is that not added information?
And you're talking about an error being added.
Yes, it's new information.
Okay, I'm not talking about whether or not there can be some letters thrown at it. I'm talking about letters that would perform the function of a.
That comes later. I just wanted.
Okay,
I'm going to the foundation here.
Respiratory system of a dinosaur.
Okay,
let me move.
I'm going to the foundation.
Let's suppose.
No. I want to establish the foundation.
We have a butterfly that has a beautiful blue color, and it's caused by a particular protein that that is spaced in a certain way so that light reflects off the butterfly. And then you do a point mutation on the butterfly. And because it's a critical point, the butterfly loses all ability to make that beautiful blue color.
Okay.
And then, but somehow it managed to survive because it has all the other stuff that it needs.
It can survive without being blue.
Then the female butterflies don't really care about the blue color and whatever, you know.
It may be even an actual advantage depending on the environment it's in.
Yeah, whatever. And then somewhere along the line, you have another point mutation that reverses the first one. Then even if you're taking a quasi-absolutist approach to it, the reverse mutation has added information and useful information. And so the idea that it mathematically can't take place is wrong.
Okay, so now you've just given two examples.
So-
a second example of how we can add information.
So I'm going to agree with you on the narrow point.
That's all I'm looking for.
Okay.
On this one.
Now, what I'm going to say is that it turns out that trying to get those kinds of mutations is unbelievably hard.
Okay.
The best example that I've seen in the literature is a virus, and it has RNA in it. It's an RNA virus, and there are 4 ribonucleotides that contribute in 3 different ways to the virus's ability to survive and reproduce. And I won't go into all the details. I've forgotten some of them, but the idea is that they were actually able to get all 4 of those back. It was a difficult, time-consuming process, and it took an evolutionary advantage of a 10 to the 17 from the wild type to the
And that doesn't matter because I'm really just trying to get to the point that you can add information because I hear that point
Yeah.
all the time, and that concept is incorrect.
And what I'm telling you is that I concede the point.
Okay. So, and you're right. What you just said is correct. I mean, it happens different ways. The odds are all over the place depending on what exactly you're looking for. Evolution doesn't look for things. It either happens or it reacts to its environment. Right. One adaptation is more successful than another.
The idea of good versus bad mutation is entirely dependent, or not entirely, but mostly dependent on the environment the organism's in.
Yeah, there are a few that are just bad, period. Like if you're missing your
If
ovaries,
you die,
you're not
just
going
die. Then it's bad.
Well, Tay Sachs disease is an interesting one, right? Because it's a negative disease from a single point mutation.
Yeah,
So,
I haven't actually looked that up. I
wish I knew more about it than that. But I mean, it was a good example of how.
But it is
Sometimes it can
definitely a
happen
single
down to
gene,
single.
and you're probably right that depending on which it is, and it may very well be,
Yeah.
because some of these things are in fact like a single frame shift mutation, and all of a sudden the entire
Yes.
rest of the protein is messed up.
Yeah.
Stop codons where they shouldn't be, crazy nonsense
Right.
amino acids being put in, and the protein doesn't do what it's supposed to do.
So, I mean, we know that there are situations where mutations can be good, they can be bad, they can be neutral.
Right,
And
and in fact, the polar bear is an example of a loss of information, a bad mutation from the informational standpoint, but one which helps the polar bear immensely because it now looks white instead of brown and can sneak up on seals without any problem.
I will say, and then I'll get off of this, that I'm not comfortable with the loss of information concept. I would just say it's different information. So it's whether or not that information is functionally better or worse is another issue. I don't see it
let's
as
put it this way:
as a loss.
if you knock out melanin production in a particular enzyme,
Mm-hmm.
it makes no difference whatsoever whether you do one single key point mutation that does the job, or a frame shift mutation that does the job, or take the entire piece out of the genome. At least as far as we know. Now, I have to say, maybe those genes are there for structural reasons, and we're a little bit of a way like kind of kids playing with the radio, and it looks like, well, you don't really need this, and you don't really need that, and the radio plays. What else do you want?
Yeah.
And sometimes, well, it's actually necessary for tuning.
Yeah.
But, and so we have to be careful about saying that we know how it works. But let's say that it sure looks like it doesn't matter whether you take the entire enzyme out or whether you do a point mutation that disables it. It disables it regardless.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. I think I killed that one. Did you have anything on a different subject?
Well, I mean, so far we seem to be focusing on process. So we're talking about mutations. And
Let's get away from the micro because we're solid on the
that's
micro.
where I'm going. Kind of is.
Yeah.
I don't know what their two positions necessarily are on the pattern. Basically looking at like the pattern of the fossil record.
Well, I'm actually not quite done with the process, but if you want to move to the pattern, we can do that.
Well, he asked me.
Well, we've just kind of spent too much time spending concentrated on micro, which is something we kind of agree with.
Here's the problem. Well,
the thing is, I'm sorry, but it seems like the point of the objections of like information and such is arguing that there's no process to get to the pattern.
Yeah.
Do you accept that there's a pattern?
Well, let's, and in fact, I think that's why I would stick with the process for just a little bit longer. And the reason is that while I agree that small bits of information can be added, and I won't say easily, but certainly possibly enough for us to observe, large bits of information are a little bit harder to come by. And by that I mean if you try to create an entire new enzyme, it's tough. It helps if you have another enzyme that's almost the same and you can tweak it in 4 or 5 places, and then create something new. The problem that you have is that sometimes you have enzymes that are an entirely new family. That is to say, their relationship to other enzymes is of the order of 20% or less, which is not that much better than random.
20% change from the previous generation,
No,
is
I
what you're saying?
mean 80% change from previous.
Oh, okay.
And see, now you've got to create like 80, and let's supposing that you need, let's say 3/4 of the enzyme to be in place before you get any effect out of it, which is probably not unreasonable. There have been estimates of how much you'd have, and certainly you need at least half.
Yeah.
But even half, to go from 20% to 50%, that's 30%, and in the meantime, there's no reward for the process to take
this
place.
Is where
It becomes important because you realize that there are novel proteins that are popping up in various organisms, including people. Like if the numbers that I last saw were about 30. That's brand new enzymes. And what is being claimed is that, well, this is just another, this comes out, and when you have something that doesn't have a good model for it, that the DNA is basically randomly related to anything else,
I'd love to see
then you have a problem.
I'd love to see the study on that. I hadn't heard that. I'd love to see where that comes from. So if when you get a chance,
I'll try to find a reference
that'd be interesting.
to orphan proteins in humans.
Yeah, but I mean, generally, I would agree with you that you don't create new proteins and enzymes because it's random, too difficult process. And that's why evolution, as it's understood, generally says that it works with what it has, makes small incremental changes, and that's the microevolution.
And, like I don't have a problem with cytochrome C being a little bit different in this organism and this organism and this organism.
Right, yeah.
That could be common design, but it could also be common descent.
Cytochrome C being related to, what are we? We're at 1 hour. Related to metabolic pathways breaking down.
That's right. So
Breaking
the
down
final
items.
approach to giving electrons
Right.
to oxygen.
Yeah, and then there's many cytochromes, which makes sense that one would develop another, and over time,
Yeah.
You'd have all
And
sorts
as
of
long as they
different
structurally
pathways.
look the same, why, sure.
right.
But the problems you have are the ones that are not related, and there are some.
Okay. So Kelly, back to you.
Okay.
Something else to throw out at us?
Yeah, I had one other question. The information instructions that would be downloaded, so to speak. How are those specific enough to change, on the macro side, change a bird respiratory system, a dinosaur respiratory system from that to a bird respiratory system? And if that did happen, then shouldn't there be some old equipment hanging around? Some fossil somewhere? Old equipment meaning what they used to have, even if it wasn't functional, still being there as a, what do you call it?
Vestigial.
Vestigial.
Yeah.
Oh, like, I don't see where you'd have room really for vestigial when you're talking about the difference between non-avian dinosaurs and avian dinosaurs' lungs. I don't know if I know enough specifically about the transition of the lungs to talk much about.
Let me qualify that just for a second, just so we have the same base path. Do you believe that dinosaurs evolved over however many long a process you want to say into birds?
Yes.
Maybe that's the first question I should ask.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so that's my question.
That is what the evidence
Okay, that's my question.
largely points to.
Okay, so that's my question. Where is the old equipment that is no longer functional, or maybe somewhat functional but not completely? Has kind of given way to the new respiratory system in the bird.
Well, I mean, they're not totally different structures. They're
Actually, I think
they're
they are.
changed from one into the other.
Reptile.
If you go back and look at
respiratory
dinosaurs, they have, I'm talking about Saurischian dinosaurs, lizard-hipped dinosaurs, which birds are rooted in. They all have air sacs permeating their bodies, just like birds do. So there's a structure that's carried over pretty much directly, which is part of their
Well, just because they might have similar function doesn't make them related. Because there's lots of things that have similar function.
Well,
you can find
Well,
bone structures in a dolphin that looks like a hand.
See, now you're
but
going
the-
to a different
the
thing.
bones are a
You're
lot
asking,
longer.
where is this within
No, I'm
these
talking-
two? And now you're saying that
yeah.
doesn't prove
No,
this.
I'm talking about the
I wasn't
respiratory
going
system.
there yet.
Okay, well, I maybe interrupt you. Sorry.
Part of the air sacs is part of their the avian respiratory system, and you find that in dinosaurs. So earlier archosaurs like crocodilians have a bellows lung, whereas birds have this really weird lung structure where it's smaller and the air flows through it into the air sacs and back, as opposed to having like similar to what crocodilians have, is more similar to our lungs, where you have just the two sacs that squeeze in it, and the oxygen uptake goes on in the lungs, whereas in the birds it's in this smaller structure that the air passes through. Again, I'm not an expert in that, so.
But if that change went on, shouldn't there be some creatures
there
running
might
around
be,
with both?
like I said, I don't know
We
enough
haven't found yet?
specifically about that.
Okay.
I'm not saying hasn't been. I'm just saying that I don't know whether or not there has been to answer that question.
I mean, if I could add something, that not everything has to have vestigial remnants that look vestigial. For example, and this goes to how does something come out of nowhere, which is what you're trying to get at. How does data come that wasn't in the original kind, right?
Specific coded data,
So-
I think that only comes from intelligent sources, but that's not part of our discussion today. But what I'm getting at is that
Well, let me just make
maybe,
my point.
maybe
I
you're
don't
not finding a lot of them.
Well, let me
that
just
have this,
let me
but
just
there
make
should
my
be
point,
some.
and then you
'Cause
can
it
tell
might-
me what that word
Okay.
is, because I
All
don't
right.
even know that one. For example, you know, where do wings come from? You saw the thing that I had put on Facebook that showed a wolf with wings,
Yeah.
which of course is
Cute.
just silly. But in birds, the ideas, as I understand it, not being a biologist, is that feathers started as a insulation tool, and that's what gave them a reason to stay in existence, right? You had a function for that organ, if you will, before it was a wing, and then eventually it generated enough size that they could do some gliding and whatever, and then it moved up into a wing. So the vestigial is there. It doesn't always look like something else. So,
That's pretty speculative.
well, I'm just saying that's just that's the consensus opinion, and that's the best I have. So I can't justify more than that.
But doesn't it sort of sound like with that explanation that somebody's looking down the road at what they want, which is not supposed to be the case?
No,
You said
it would
that your feathers develop to
it
keep
would
warmer or more
no,
buoyant.
it would if
they're
if you
looking-
jump from wings to no function prior to that, which is why the example that you gave earlier would not happen of, I forget what it was, but X animal crossed with Y kind of a thing. Evolution cannot create that as we understand it, because you have to come from the working material and the working environment that you have to derive from. You can't just throw wings on an amoeba or whatever. You have to derive small steps up from what you
Or
what
wings
you
on
have
the wolf that
what
you're
you have to
going
work.
do.
Right,
You
exactly.
know, wings on the wolf aren't going to help him fly. They just get in his way.
Well, the other problem with the wolf is that you need a lot more than wings.
Yeah, a lot more.
Right. So
And
you've got
the way wings have come about on mammals, at least twice and probably 3 times, is that you had the 4 limbs stretch out.
right.
And so when you see pictures of a dragon with 4 legs and 2 wings, you know that either this is highly mutant or else it didn't happen.
Right. Well, like the bat would be a good example.
Yeah,
Right.
the
And
bat-
flying squirrels. I
bat
mean, that's
has the-
kind of your intermediate step,
Yeah,
if you will.
well, the bat or the bird
Even the-
or the pterodon or whatever.
Pterosaurs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the flying reptiles that all their front limbs have been turned into wings
Right.
by whatever.
So
process.
those are examples of where your vestigials would be. They are essentially built in. The function may change from, in the case of feathers, from insulation to flying. I mean, it
Yeah.
does both, obviously, at this
Yeah.
point, or it can
and,
do both.
and we have to be very careful about
But-
vestigials in this because bats have little thumbs sticking out that they use very nicely to hook onto the
Yes.
onto
Yeah.
the roof of the cave. And is that vestigial? Well, the bat doesn't think so.
Right, but but vestigial is a perfectly valid concept. I mean, we've had cave fish that have lost eyesight, for example, and those things have not evolved away. Presumably,
If
they
you want
would.
to stick with birds, like a kiwi has little tiny stubby
Do
wings that are totally
Yeah.
useless for flying.
we have an example of the cave fish that could see?
Well, of
I
could we do.
Would assume
do?
yes.
The cave fish are related to other fish outside.
Yeah.
And in fact, in some interesting types, cave fish from cave A can mate with cave fish from cave B and produce seeing offspring. And the reason why is because in cave A, the damage was to one part of the visual system. In cave fish B, it was damage to the other part of the visual
Right.
system. And when you cross them, they have, the deficiencies are compensated for.
Yeah, so the idea there would be that the losing vision would not be a deficit.
That's a loss.
That's a loss, yeah.
It's,
But it would not be a deficit.
It's nice in caves. That's
it's things like eyes.
But
are
it's
kind
a
of
but it's a
expensive.
gain. It's a gain in the sense that the animal is not expending calories and energy to generate those
Exactly. They're
things.
expensive structures,
So-
and if they're useless
They
in the
can-
environment,
And there's examples
There's
of
no-
viruses that have lost the
Right.
ability to be immune
See,
to something. Or lost ability to be
and my
affected
point
by
is
something.
that in some ways the polar bear is the same way. Melanin for it is a useless structure, at least in the hair. In fact, it's detrimental.
Yes. Yeah. Well, again, if there's no detriment to losing the function, you can lose them. It doesn't always happen, but they can be lost, and the cave fish is a good example of that. So, did you have anything else for us, Paul?
Well,
Scott? What's our time?
I'm going to go with the go back to the process maybe, and ask if you have, because the dispute is really not between species so much as it is between, let's say, families. So imagine a carnivore critter that is partway between a bear and a cat and a dog, or if you prefer, an African hunting dog and so it's supposed to somehow differentiate those three. I mean, I assume we don't presume that cats actually came from bears. It's
Correct.
actually
it would be an
came from
ancestor, a common
a
ancestor.
common ancestor of
A
some
common
kind.
ancestor, yeah.
Can you find that common ancestor, number one? And number two, how many intermediates would it take to get between that ancestor and a cat or a dog or a bear?
You want to take that?
And
I don't
should
know
we
if there's any way
find
to
those?
Quantify a specific number, but there is in fact a group of fossil organisms that are called bear dogs because they morphologically are kind of intermediate between dogs and bears. Cats are more distantly related. But yeah, farther back you go, generally the farther back you go in the fossil record, the less distinction there is between the modern groups that we have now. Like I was talking about earlier, horses and rhinoceroses and tapirs. Farther you go back into the fossil record, the closer they all get morphologically until it's very difficult to distinguish what is the proto-rhino from the proto-horse. And you get that a lot when you go back to like the Hyracotherium or Eohippus level of fossil horses.
How far back is that? I'm curious, if you know, roughly.
I think it's like 50 million years, something like
Well,
that.
Eohippus is in the Eocene. That's why it's called Eohippus.
Yeah, well, no, Eohippus is dawn horses.
Right.
It's not necessarily related, it's Eocene. Like I said, that name has been resurrected recently. It was Hyracotherium for most of the time, has been considered the correct name because of the rules
Yeah.
of nomenclature. You go back farther in the fossil record, and what are now fairly distinct groups merge morphologically until it's hard to tell what you're looking at. You know, the thing being the ancestor of. You go back to the time of Hyracotherium, the ancestors of horses and rhinoceroses were very similar.
I think one of the things that strikes me here is, when you look at what is currently there, it really is almost impossible to tell where it's going, right? Because it's not necessarily going someplace. We don't know what mutations are going to happen. We don't know what environmental conditions are going to change. We know some. We know things about glacial cycles and things like that, and hopefully you can maybe toss out some of the things like getting hit by meteors. But so it's hard for a lot of people, and not you guys, but I mean people who have less knowledge about this stuff to visualize a transitional species, because they're not going out into the museums and seeing all the ones in the past. They're just looking at this current bear and saying, there's no way a bear can turn into a lizard. It's just very unintuitive. So you can't really project forward other than to tell them in an evolution class that we know that evolution, or the best theory we have in evolution, the best evidence is that evolution will not develop beyond the tool set that it currently has, right? Other than, mutations are very small and very tiny, and there's so many variables from now to a million years from now that you can't tell where it's going to go. So one would not expect a giraffe to grow wings and things like that. But you can go back to you look in the other direction. You can go back into the fossil history and look at one of these 50 million old ancestors, and I don't think there's anything that would incline you to think that, oh, this one's going to grow an opposing thumb someday. Why? There's too many variables, and you have no way to predict that. So it's easier to look back because you have some evidence, at least especially nowadays. And as we go on, there's more and more evidence. There was less evidence, 200 years ago with the fossil record, and certainly when you mix in Gould's punctuated equilibrium theory.
The thing with birds is a prime example. For a long time, all they had was Archaeopteryx and a couple other things, toothed birds like Ichthyornis and Hesperornis, these early birds with teeth. But other than that, they look fairly modern in their anatomy. But you had Archaeopteryx, which is like almost dead, morphologically dead center between a small dinosaur and modern birds. And that was the situation forever. And then like 20 years ago or so, they started uncovering these things in China, and it's just exploded. Just goo gobs of intermediates with different feather types, ranging from fairly modern type feathers to just these wispy, downy hair-like structures. And morphologically, just as far as the rest of the body, everything from clearly dinosaurian to more clearly bird things that prior to finding those things 20 years ago or so, you point and go, oh, you got nothing. All you got is that Archaeopteryx, and then they would even denounce that as being an actual intermediate. And now, just because we've found this one particular area where there was just the right conditions for preserving the feathers and stuff, boom, now we know all the stuff that existed that we didn't know before.
Are they allowing you to examine those now?
Yeah.
Because for a long period of time they didn't.
As far as I know, if you go into the museums, you can take a look at them.
And there's been some...
You probably have to do
a lot
one
of them
in China.
Yeah, in China, you're going to have to go there.
But what I've read, and this is a while ago, so I can't tell you where I read it at, but there's been several of those that have been proven to be fraudulent. They've made
there was the one that was glued together from a couple different legitimate fossils. You had a farmer trying to make a quick buck, and he dug up a couple different things and stuck them together.
Apparently,
and
it's
it
good enough
got on
to
the fossil market.
fool the National Geographic. So.
They were dumb. They didn't let the scientists take a good look at it before they hyped it.
Well, I think that they were dumb, but they were also credulous. And that's generally true of all frauds. That the best frauds are ones that people can kind of believe.
Yeah. But over time, those things do get corrected. I mean, sometimes it takes time.
They may take a long time, but you're right. And in the meantime, people grow up hearing about them and being told that they prove this or that. I would think one benefit that comes out of this type of discussion is that these things do get honed down a little bit. So when I was thinking about what to ask and stuff, I was noticing that was helping us hone out the real information versus the speculations. Mm-hmm. And when you have a fraud like that, you want to get it out, and you want to I guess that's the point, that you don't necessarily, sometimes on the science side they do jump too far ahead. Certainly the media science reporting jumps way too far ahead on, well, we have the cure of cancer, or the missing link or whatever.
So it would behoove scientists to be
Everything's
a little more
different now.
accurate in their
Yeah,
speech.
and actually that's become a huge problem in medicine in particular. You mentioned cancer, and Amgen decided that it was going to put some money into science research to try to see if they could, make some miracle cures for cancer and make a few bucks off of it. And before they spent $3 billion on it, they decided, well, we better find out, how reliable are these studies anyway? So they picked some 53 of the most groundbreaking studies to reproduce, and they could only reproduce 7 of them. And in fact, they talked to one of the researchers who told them, well, actually, they said we'd done it, 6 times and we couldn't get it to come out right. And the guy said, well, we actually tried it about, I think it was 20 or 30 times, and then we got it to work, and then we published it.
Yeah.
And you're going,
Yeah.
and this is,
Yeah, I agree. I've
it can be scary out there.
I've heard of a movement, and I don't know if it's made progress at all within the scientific community to increase the standards for such things.
Oh yeah.
So that basically to publish everything, publish the negatives, and if you get funded, you publish the result. Period. And that would help. Because there are definitely false positives out there.
And the problem is that the negatives never get published, and so when the false positive is published, everybody thinks it's positive until somebody comes along and tests it. And in fact, there's a saying in medicine, which is probably ought to be good for science in general, is that one study is no studies.
Yes, yeah. I mean, this is why I always push the idea of scientific consensus, because one study is not a study, one scientist is not a final word.
Right.
Well, then when the media gets a hold of it, things it drives me nuts when I hear these things.
Okay.
News reports, well, such and such doubles your doubles your chance of getting cancer. Okay, that you don't know anything unless you know what the background rate is.
Okay.
It was 1 in 1,000. Now it's 2 in 1,000 people will get there.
So does anybody have a final word before we open up to audience questions?
I'm good.
You're good?
Well, the other question that has to do more with process is, besides how many intermediates and how many should we find, is what do we do with the Cambrian explosion? Are we? And it's fair to say this because obviously it's happened in the past. Are we waiting for future discoveries to find out what the ancestors were, or are we? Do we have a rational explanation of phyla just appearing, as Richard Dawkins said famously at one point, as if they were planted there?
I will tell you exactly what we do is we have another panel on that specific topic.
Works for me.
Yeah. And
no, I agree. There's no way we can solve all of the stuff in.
This is one of the breaking evolution down into subtopics, and that's definitely a subtopic. It's definitely a topic to be covered.
That and on the fossil record, I would say, just like I was talking
Fossil
about
record
the
being another one,
birds,
yeah.
Forever, for years and years and years and years, we had nothing but Archaeopteryx, a couple of things. And then now we have more.
Yeah.
It could be next week somebody finds a fossil locality that's Precambrian that has things we haven't seen before.
Yeah, and honestly, the only knowledge.
And I think you're right in this sense that I don't think that not having an answer for some of those questions is necessarily a game breaker.
Oh no! If you don't know, you don't know.
On the other hand, I think that it's also fair to say that people who look at it and go, "But you haven't really proven this thing," also have a fair point too.
Oh, for sure. I mean, proof, and this is why we're going to do, I keep referring to other episodes, this is why we're going to do an episode on historical science. I mean, there's a difference between being able to do, a chemistry experiment and figure out what's in this thing versus archaeology, for example, where you're just putting together bits and pieces.
Yeah,
so,
as Jerry Coyne famously said.
Did he? Okay.
Oh, evolutionary biology is at the bottom of the pecking order. Physics and chemistry.
Yeah.
And that's because you don't have the kinds of things you'd like to have.
Yeah, and at some point, some of these subjects come together and some of them don't. And some of them fall apart. So like,
That would be the attitude some scientists have. I don't know if he would agree that evolutionary biology is in fact on the bottom of the pecking order, but
anyways, I think this was a good discussion. Thank you for getting all the questions out. Thank you, everybody. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll do some audience Q&A.